Hi, today I'm going to be putting binding along the scalloped edge of a quilt, and I have already pieced the top of the quilt and I have quilted it. I've also determined where my arcs are going to be around the outside edge to form the scallops. I've decided to place 2 arcs on the edge of each block here so that when it's done and the excess fabric is trimmed away, it will actually look like a heart and it'll be really very cute. One of the things I've done is, after I've marked my scallops, and these first couple here I've marked with a darker ink so that you can see it a little bit clearer. But I've marked where the scallops are going to be, and then right along that line I basted it with a large basting stitch, and that's so that when I go to apply my binding, I'll make sure I'm using that as a determination to show me right where the edge of my quilt is going to be and where the raw edge of the binding is going to line up. It also keeps it from stretching and keeps the edge much more stable. Another thing we're going to be using is this seam here in between each block, because that's where 2 curves come together, and that will allow us to use this seam line as an indicator of where we need to stop when we apply our binding, so that we can have our needle down right on that seam line and then pivot as we go to the next arc. Now, because these are hearts, we also have a dip right in the center. And so what I've done is, with a pin that will remove easily, I have added a straight line directly down so I can now use that for my determination when I'm coming around and sewing my binding in place. When the needle punctures that line, that's where I will sink my needle, pivot my fabric, readjust my binding, and continue on with the next arc. Here you can more closely see the arc coming in, changing positions right at this low point, right here on this seam, arcing up to the center of the heart. Here's our line and the indicator in the center to help us with our pivoting. And our next arc, at this point we'll use the seam. The next arc we'll use a little mark in the center. And we'll continue all the way around the quilt. This is the binding I'll be using. It is cut 2 inches wide, and I've made it on the bias, and I made it as the continuous bias binding that you'll find in another tutorial. And I've simply taken it and folding it in half lengthwise, placing the 2 raw edges together. When I start just above one of the arcs, and about 1/3 of the way up to the center point is where I'll start my sewing, and I'll be placing the 2 raw edges right next to that drawn line and the basting line. I'll sink my needle 1/4 inch away from the edge of the binding, and I'll slowly quilt or sew around, following the arc, until the needle comes to a point that if I lift up, I can see that it will be right in that line that I drew earlier. At that point, with the needle down, we'll simply lift the foot, shift the fabric so that the raw edge lines up with the next arc, and begin sewing. You may find it easier if you pin each arc into place as you get to them, and sew 1 arc at a time, and while the needle is in the down position, go ahead and adjust the binding to the next arc and pin it in place, and sew to the next low point, and then do the same thing. Make sure your needle is in that seam line, pivot your fabric, adjust your binding, and place a few pins to hold it, and stitch to the next low point. We're now at the sewing machine, and I have the edge of my quilt where my scallops have been previously marked and then basted along the arcs underneath the foot. I'm going to be using the marks on each seam line as a pivot point, and also I'm adding a mark halfway in between to use as a pivot point as well. My binding has been made. It is a bias binding, continuous fold, starting 2 inches thick and then folded in half lengthwise with the raw edges together. The 2 raw edges are going to be placed right next to the curve of the arc. And I will start approximately a third of the way up on the arc, placing the binding raw edges next to the curve, and without stretching it, just easing it around, I will then sew a 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the fabric, following the contour of that arc. You may find that it's easier for you to pin as you go and do one arc at a time, or you can just pivot around a little at a time. I'll continue around the arc until I reach that middle divot. And I'll stitch a little bit, so you can even lift up your foot and see, and I don't know if you can quite see, I'm not quite to that point. So I'm going to place the binding back in place and take another 2 stitches and double check to make sure I'm right on that pivot point. And I am. At this point, I will shift my fabric so that the next arc is in front of the needle, in front of the foot. I will then adjust my binding so that there's no folds at that lower edge, lower my foot, and continue to the second arc. Again, I'll be placing the raw edge of the binding right on that basting line. And continue around, sew a little, adjust the binding, and keep sewing. When I get down to this next arc, I will again wait until the needle comes and penetrates that seam line. At that point, I'll have my needle down. I will again pivot and move forward to the next arc. Continue doing this until you've gone all the way around your quilt. And then join the ends like you would normally, either with a blunt join or with a diagonal join. You may find that it's easier to pin between each arc once you've made your pivot, in which case just go ahead and pivot your fabric, line your binding up where it needs to go for the next arc, and simply use a few pins to pin it in place. It's easier and keeps it smoother if you pin approximately where the seam is going to be sewn, and it'll lay flatter that way. Good luck.